Hello everyone. So we're now at the second video for this week on comparison contrast, and I'm talking now about your thesis formula and goal that you should be working toward, and then we're going to start talking about the body paragraphs in the first section, which will be background. So for the thesis, very simply, I'm asking that you include a similarity and a difference, and I know this seems rather minimal, but basically these are the foundation of your structure. And instead of asking for a bigger picture to be added on, I just want you to have the idea of bigger picture in mind already as you're establishing and articulating these 2 points. So it is there, but it's not something I'm necessarily expecting to see tagged on to the end. And I'll show you that when we look at a model. So another way I phrase the organization of this thesis is just within a model sentence like this, in which you could just kind of fill in the missing pieces with your topic. So the structure says, well, both subject, meaning whatever the person is or the community is that you're looking at, and I, and then you define that similarity. We differ in that, and then you define the difference, right? So this is very general. There's a lot of different ways that you could complicate the language and change it around a bit, but it's just a way to frame things so that you know you're not only looking at similarity and you're not only looking at difference, you're developing an interaction between those two concepts. So let's check it out in the model student essay, or my model essay that we have here. So we already kind of looked over the introduction, which you can check out on your own. But here I have the thesis. So it says, well, Smith and I align in aiming to promote vernacular within global culture. We differ on our views of how this should be carried out. I tend to think writers should humanize only their own cultures through authentic language, not others as well. So I have here the setup of a very specific connection, right? The idea of aiming to promote vernacular within global culture. And so that's something that I would spend the first half of my body just kind of dissecting and looking at what does this mean for her and what does it mean for me exactly. And then the second part, right, the difference is this idea that I feel like the way that we want to accomplish that goal is different. So as you can see, everything is connected here. It's not that the difference is in a totally different area of cultural mythology or identity from the connection. I really want you to choose a similarity and difference that have interaction with each other. So they're going to transition from one to the next. And this is why it's really important to organize things in this way within the thesis, right? Because your similarity is going to lead into the difference, which I assume will add a little bit of complexity to your analysis, right? So my complication here, we differ on our views of how this should be carried out. I tend to think writers should humanize only their own cultures through authentic language, not others as well. So the assumption here is that I'm going to talk about how Zadie Smith is really big on trying to use vernacular and slang and dialect for any culture around the world, and she's kind of very open to that. Whereas, even though I'm also really into embracing vernacular, I feel like it can be really risky trying to use vernacular from a culture that's not a part of your genetic makeup or identity somehow. So, setting up the 2 points very directly is going to give a clear organization and also establish a very specific point of view as well. So that's the first thing I wanted to talk about for this section. And then we're just going to start talking a little bit about the body, really just the main part here in this video. So the first thing that makes the structure of this paper a little bit different from previous ones, if we go back to what I outlined here, is that instead of just immediately getting into similarity and difference, I'm asking for you to give a little bit of background. And the reason for that is just because for a longer paper like this, it's just an expectation that you're going to have a more extended kind of contextual framework. And this is also going to save some time, just like I asked you for the previous paper, to give a little bit of a description of your story. It's kind of the same thing here, where you're showing us that you're very familiar with this person or this community, and you're kind of defining who this is or what this is, so that we can already have that in our mind before we get into the complexity of your similarity and difference. So the way I describe the background here is one paragraph that gives a brief summary or context on the individual or community you're interpreting. And there's kind of two things you should be thinking about. The first one, this is the only section that's going to be mostly facts, right? I know I've talked about how I don't want your research to be only facts. I want it to be mostly providing point of view. But this will be kind of the one section of your paper where you're just giving us a little bit of information. It could be just entirely your own summary. It could integrate a little bit of research. It definitely can have point of view, but the main goal is really just to establish some factual context for us. And then the second thing for this section is to be sure that you're providing details only for what's necessary, right? That this could easily become more than a paragraph and like a couple of pages in your essay in which you're saying, here's the entire biography of this person that I'm comparing to myself, or the entire history of this community. But what you need to do is simplify to just a paragraph of no more than maybe half a page to a page that's telling us this is the important information you need to understand about this person or this community in order to figure out what I'm trying to do with my similarity and difference. So let's look just briefly at my model here. On the second page of the example, even with the topic sentence, I'm trying to set up the fact that its background context, Smith's particular background warrants an affinity for vernacular. So I'm setting up the goal of I'm going to give a little bit of background on this person, but it's also going to set up my particular topic of vernacular, right? The daughter of a British World War II veteran father and Jamaican social worker mother, she grew up in London's working class. So as you can tell already from the style here, I definitely am just kind of giving a little bit of a factual summary. While neither of her parents are associated with the uproar in urban slang as a popular communication strategy, she and her siblings are. In her essay Dead Man Laughing regarding her father's love for comedy and the genre's legacy for his children, she mentions the oddity of her and her siblings' existence in their community, noting that in his comedy performances, her younger brother, as the only black man in the room, was aware of his body in a space of others, so he was going to play it, the same way we had played it throughout our childhood, a few degrees off whatever it was that people expected of us when they looked at us. So I know I mentioned this in class already, the idea of how it would be really useful if you could find some maybe first-hand accounts from the person that you're writing about and integrate a little bit of that within your analysis. So obviously, since the person I'm focused on here is a writer, I have a lot of materials along those lines. But you might be able to find something like I've included here. I've just set up, I'm not going to read all of this, but it's an outsider's perspective that's talking a little bit about her legacy. So I have facts in here, but I also have just some sprinklings of information that just help to enliven the image I'm trying to paint of this particular person, right? And so that's something you should really be thinking about for the background is how can I find, a creative and engaging way to provide some facts that are going to allow my readers to understand exactly who this person is or what this community is about before I get into really breaking it down with complexity. So we'll stop here and then we'll talk about that breakdown and how to conclude things. I will be right back.